My name's Chris Webster. I run the Archaeology Podcast Network, and you guys signed up on this through Team Black, which is a growing list of videos and resources and webinars like this one that we're curating all about archaeology and anthropology. And we're actually moving some of our other live webinars to recording, and then the back catalog of these webinars that Alan is doing over to Patreon. And Patreon allows us to basically essentially charge less, but it's a monthly charge, and you can do it for as long as you want. So I think it's $1, $3, $7, $10, and $20 or $25 or something, and you get different levels of videos. And it allows us to, it allows you to do it for a little while, or do it forever, or support us for however long as you want, watch all the videos and then quit, something like that. So it's a little more flexible for us. So head on over to patreon.com/Team Black for that. Head over to arccert.black for all the other Team Black webinars. We're going to get going with this. So this is going to be about an hour. We haven't done this one yet, so I'm hoping it's about an hour. I don't know if you've timed it, Alan.
About an hour.
It was about an hour. And then at the end, I'll turn my microphone back on and my video back on, and we will have a question and answer period with Dr. Garfinkel for about an hour as well. So we're booked till about 8:30 on this. And one more note, as a loud helicopter flies over my hotel room, I'm doing this from a field project I'm at in Yuma, Arizona, and the internet here may be unstable. So if that affects the recording or how you can hear Alan or what you can see, I'm aware of that, but this is being recorded, and if we can't get a solid recording out of this because of the internet, then Alan and I will do this again next week on our own. I'll put it up, and you guys, it won't be on the Team Black site, so you won't have to pay for it. You've already paid for this, but I'll put it on a secure page on the Team Black website. You'll be able to log in for about 2 or 3 weeks and watch the video as many times as you want. So that will be available for you to review and see in the future. Okay. We got M. Cranon here. I'm going to go ahead and mute your microphone as you come in. Thanks for joining us. All right. And I'm going to mute all my stuff and take it away, Alan.
Well, thank you, Chris. It's a pleasure and honor to continue with the Advanced Anthropological Studies webinar series. This is webinar number 5. And what we've been doing is discussing and showcasing a lot of different anthropological topics. During my last live presentation, one of the most desired and interesting subjects, according to all of the attendees, was the peopling of the Americas. So I felt it would be valuable to revisit this one and share some knowledge and some of the cutting edge information I was able to glean on the subject. I'm an archaeologist, anthropologist, been doing this work for about 40 years. I reside in Southern California, currently have a home in this field, do a lot of work all over the state of California, and have interests in working with Native people. If you would like to get in touch with me, on the screen is my email, avram, A-V-R-A-M, 1952@yahoo.com, or certainly call me and leave a voicemail. If I have to get back to you, I will. 805-312-2261. So, peopling of the Americas, models of the migration into the New World. So, basic debate in the peopling of the Americas has really focused on and revolved around both a short chronology and a long chronology. What I mean by that is that the movement into the New World was thought to have occurred initially only about, let's say, 14 to 16,000 years ago, and was followed by successive waves of migration. And that really was the general tenor for many, many years, probably since the 1930s, until there became an upwelling and a bit of controversy about the possibility of what they call a long chronology. And this long chronology is positioned in the sense that there would have been movement and direct occupation of the New World, the Americas, beginning about 20,000 years ago, or perhaps even earlier. And remarkably, only in the last decade, or even in the last as much as, let's say, even a half a dozen years ago, have we now begun to have the preponderance of evidence support the long chronology. And so what we're going to talk about is how that occurred. We're also going to focus in on a number of different elements and factors that have led to the repositioning or reinterpretation of the nature of the population and movement throughout the New World. So the first thing we have to sort of focus in on is the land bridge migration versus the watercraft migration. Up until rather recently, exclusively we had focused in on the issue of a land bridge migration, and that this was the means of connecting from Siberia into Alaska and into the New World, and was to have been the corridor, one of the sole corridors. It may have been supplemented with watercraft simply to colonize the Pacific coast, but that was our thoughts up until relatively recently. The other side is watercraft migration might have occurred from a number of different places other than Siberia, Australia, Asia, Europe, or there might have been multiple waves of migration, and those multiple waves would have used the sea as a means of populating the New World. So, the basis of the debate, the basis of the controversy and the continuing higgling and haggling over the issue of when and where and how the New World was populated. Part of the problem in our understanding of the whole process is that the archaeological evidence between North and South America is rather disparate. There's a difference in the archaeological record, there's a difference in the physical remains, and there's a difference in the way in which we see the timing of the sites that appear in the archaeological record vary rather dramatically from North America. Another central question is the basal culture for most of the North America, and even South America for that matter, was the Clovis tradition. Well, the Clovis tradition seems to have originated full-blown without antecedents, which is rather difficult to understand. So we are asking ourselves, where did Clovis originate? How did it develop? Where did it develop? And what were the preconditions that provided the Clovis people the opportunity to move and proliferate throughout the Americas? Let's look at the focus of the debate. There's a number of data sets here that have to work together. One of these is the geological obstacles to overcome. What I'm talking about there is the ice sheets or the glaciers. The other data set we have to look at is lithic technology, the types of stone tools, their form, their character, the lithic reduction sequence, the actual way and the character, the morphology, and the form and character of the flake stone remains as we have discovered them. Additionally, we have the genetic evidence. What does the DNA, both nuclear and mitochondrial DNA, have to say about the timing, character, direction of the population of the Americas? And finally, what about language, the linguistic analysis, the diversity of languages, their genetic basis, their historical basis, the comparison of languages from one to the next? How does that all work together? And the debaters, they're everybody and anybody. And so we can see them coming in from various camps and various perspectives and bringing their expertise to play. So the theory, for much of our understanding of the New World, related to a land bridge that was crossed across the Bering Strait. Now that land bridge connected Siberia to North America, and across that land bridge, we believed, and I think most of us still believe to a great extent, that this Clovis tradition of what we call big game hunters came across that land bridge and were some of the most substantial peopling population to initiate occupation of the Americas. If we look at the inverse model of that, we can look at the possibility of what we call watercraft migration. We have a Pacific coastal model, we have the model from Australia and Oceania, and we have the Atlantic coastal model. So let's look at the land bridge theory to begin with. This is also called the Bering Strait or Beringia theory. And what we're talking about here is a physical migration of people from Siberia to Alaska. And we believe that the Paleo-Indian people, as they are called, tracked and hunted big game. These would be called the megafauna. And these big game emphasis is supported and demonstrated by kill sites or Paleo-Indian sites, chiefly in the American Southwest and on the plains. We're talking about a 1,000-mile strip of land that connected the two continents. So as you can see in that uppermost part of this particular slide, there is Berengia and the Bering Strait. And if we look at it, as it might have been perceived 11,000 or even 21,000 years ago, we can see the land or the land bridge that in fact connected the two continents. During the period of the Wisconsin Glaciation, which was 50,000 to about 10,000 years ago, we had ice sheets that were up to 2 miles thick, which lowered the sea level, as we mentioned, approximately 200 feet straight meters. The land bridge, 21,000 is on the left, 11,000 is on the right. You can see that it was most massive and contiguous earlier in time than it was later in time. Also agree that there was a very thick ice sheet, which lowered sea level 200 feet. That was during the Wisconsin, 50K to 10K. We're talking about the Mackenzie Corridor, which is between the Laurentide and the Cordillera glaciers. Then as we see Berengia during this Wisconsin glaciation, here's the mapping, and here's that corridor that we know in terms of current understanding was actually open and available for population and immigration and movement about 14,000 years ago. So there's a lot of speculation about the routes of travel, the routes of migration. And so we're not really certain how and in what order and what direction people came into the Americas. But we do know that if they did move through that Mackenzie corridor, there was only certain benchmarks or time periods that that particular travel portal was available. If we look between 40 and 36,000 years ago, the Mackenzie corridor was in fact closed. If we look at the land bridge from 36 to 32,000 years ago, the land bridge was submerged. If we look at the window of 32 to 24, the land bridge was open, the corridor was open, but the coastal route was impacted by the ice flows. So when we hit that 24 to 14, the Mackenzie corridor is almost closed. It looked like it just began open at 14,000 point. And so the land bridge had to be open, the route had to be open, and the corridor. The technological complex, the pattern of lithic technology, flaked stone, was known as Clovis. Clovis is a lanceolate, basally indented dart point form. It has a prominent flute or a flake taken out at its base. And both in North and Central America and South America, we believe that the Clovis expression certainly began by about 13,500 years ago and ran up to about 12,800 years ago. Growing evidence indicates the duration of Clovis probably increased or continued in some areas for quite a while after that 12,800 years ago. The South American sites are of equal age, but the South American point forms are quite different. They call those fish tails below. And the ones that are in North America are much more lanceolate and larger without those constricted necks. And when you get to the far west of the Great Basin in California, you find that Clovis or Western Clovis points have flutes. They also don't have flutes. They're also, besides being percussion flake, they're pressure flake. And often they're considerably smaller than we find in the American Southwest or on the plains. So, what do we know about the DNA? Well, the DNA evidence, the cutting edge, the brand new stuff that's just come out, is the scientists have found that this is nuclear DNA evidence for the southward migration of people, spreading the Clovis culture in North America, and they also had a major impact farther south, what is now Chile, Brazil, and Belize. And so you can see this here, this ancestral flow coming in. We look at Anzac and the Clovis culture. We see the Belize, the Central Andes, etc. So there's several different migration strands. And if we look at the data genetically, we see several different distinctive populations. There's an ancestral population in South America today. There's one that's associated with the Anzac burial out in the Southwest. And there's another that seems to be a much more coastal influence associated with the Andes. So, for the longest time, we were arguing back and forth about whether Clovis and this Clovis culture, which was initially identified back in 1932 in Clovis, New Mexico, was in fact the basal culture for the earliest occupation of the Americas. We finally pinned down that it flourished, most specifically, during that period of time, from about 13,500 years ago to about 12,008. We have quite a bit of radiocarbon evidence to support that. And we find that these Clovis-type artifacts move together, proliferate, and then suddenly decline rather radically in the archaeological record. And as I've said, in some areas, it did linger. One of the problems with understanding Clovis is the distribution of Clovis sites in North America. It's rather striking and rather erratic. There's a tremendous concentration of Clovis material on the East Coast, within the eastern United States, perhaps to some extent in the American Southwest and on the plains. But when you abut the Rocky Mountains, it dramatically declines. And there, throughout the far west, the manifestation of Clovis is much reduced, tremendously reduced, and of a different character. Why is that? We're not sure. There's many ideas. It could be a function of the geomorphology, the antiquity of the landforms, the preservation, or it could be a variety of other explanations in terms of perhaps different migration strategies, different sorts of people populating those parts of the country, and not a different antiquity necessarily, perhaps different groups of people using different sorts of technology and different sorts of flakestone and lithic technology. So what is the issue and problems with Clovis? Well, the problem with Clovis was if the Clovis people traveled south after entering North America and reached the tip of South America by 11,000 years ago, it didn't really provide a lot of time for people to populate an entire hemisphere. We're talking about quite a bit of, quite a lengthy trek if it was simply across the landform. We also found growing evidence that there may have been, in fact, and now the researchers largely agree that there is a pre-Clovis expression to be found in the Americas. Monteverde was one of the earliest contenders and had some of the most persuasive evidence for a pre-Clovis occupation with highly well-preserved both organic and inorganic materials, and firmly in support of 14,600 years ago. That's 1,000 years earlier than the earliest dates of Clovis. Now, if we look back to the Siberian side, we've got Malta at 24,000. We've got the split from Siberia at about 23,000 years ago. And then we look over and we see that there's a very late pulse in the Inuit and the Athabascans, but the earlier pulse must have come from Siberia and into the Americas. So, Monteverde, Chile, was excavated by Tom Dillahay. All the radiocarbon dates from Monteverde clustered around 12,500 to 12,800. And when calibrated, they demonstrated an earlier level between 14.6 and 14.8, about 1,000 years before Clovis ever started. The site is preserved extremely well by peat. Wood, bones, skin, meat, and even botanicals are extremely well preserved. Now, to throw a monkey wrench in all of this, because of the tremendous preservation there are three cultural features that are rather controversial, but that do, in some perspectives, in some camps, show that there was human occupation at the site, but that was dated to 33,000 years ago. So that is rather surprising and not well accepted. So of all the radiocarbon dates from Monteverde, we know that there's a scientific consensus now that Monteverde is indeed an authentic pre-Clovis site inhabited from at least 14,500 years ago, about 1,000 years before the earliest Clovis occupation. So what's happened in terms of our understanding of the peopling of the Americas? Well, until 1997, there wasn't any site that was really accepted as pre-Clovis. And almost all the sites at that point were 11,000, 11,500 radiocarbon years before present. But that year, in that year, 1997, was when the Paleo-Indian specialists went to Monteverde, Chile, and they declared it to be valid. Since that time, there's many, many other sites all throughout South America and North America that have provided evidence for perhaps tangible pre-Clovis occupations. And of course, they include the Channel Islands, Meadowcroft, Cactus Hill, and then throughout South America, Pedro Pintada, Pedro Ferrada, Quebrada Tacuay, Quebrada Laguay, and Tematema. So all those various sites have something to contribute to our conversation about pre-Clovis occupation in the Americas. So there's a little bit more problem with Clovis in terms of the way we thought about it. We have new evidence that's emerged that shows the subsistence patterns of these earliest inhabitants were much more varied than we originally supposed. In this novel view, these earliest Americans, or some of the earliest Americans certainly, were not all hunters that were spearing big game, such as mammoths and bison, as they've been portrayed. We have found that many of these people who first came to the Americas relied on a very diverse set of resources. Big game was part of it, but small game as well. Plants, fruits, marine life, and just about anything else at hand. When we have had good evidence, we find the foods that they're eating included turtles, shellfish, and tubers. And this was a significant diet change over this emphasis that we originally had on big game pursuing mammoth, bison, even camels. We've gotten this information from human coprolites. These are the excrement that is preserved even in Oregon caves, dry caves, And Paisley Cave is one of them. That tells us a bit about the actual diet and the relative proportions of food, both plant and animal food, that was available to these early Paleo-Indians. So let's talk more about the land migration route, Beringia to the tip of South America. We have some, fairly recent work by the University of Florida modeling the population and talking about the occupation and the timing of those movements. The evidence seems to link an expansion out of East Central Asia, between 45 and 35,000 years ago. Then we see the occupation of Berengia, 36 to 16, and then from 16 on, we see the expansion into the Americas. Their estimation is about 1,000 to 5,000 people entered the Americas by these land, based sort of an indication of the way in which this could have been done, and taking a look at the populations that were pre-European contact, and then figuring back using computer simulation models. What about watercraft migration? This is a whole other different way of thinking about the peopling of the Americas. We have a Pacific coastal model, we got an Australia, Oceania model, and the Atlantic coastal model. What we're talking about is we look at this enormous map of the world, and we notice that in Africa we have 65,000 years worth of prehistory, when we've got 40,000 there in Europe, 60,000 in India, 50,000 in Australia, we got 50,000 in China. But when we come to the Americas, we find the time depth is truncated dramatically. 16,000 up in Alaska and 15,000 down in South America. So how can that be? How did the Americas, a continent which was relatively attractive in terms of its natural resources, become a land without people? Well, the Pacific coastal models tell us that people reached the Americas via water travel, following the coastlines from Northeast Asia into the Americas. Now, that would have been the coastal route. They're not excluding the land migration, but they do talk about how colonists could have reached Monteverde in southern Chile in a relatively short amount of time in a more reasonable fashion. So I'd say one of the most known and renowned proponents of this hypothesis is John Erlandson and his colleagues. And his particular model of the population of the Americas has been termed or renamed the kelp highway hypothesis. And what he's saying is that there may have been a means by which people could have moved in boats along the coastline, the western coastline of the Americas, and done that via boats, and done that in a safe and relatively easy journey. The basis of this is the productive kelp forests, which has supported these similar suites of plants and animals even around the world. And at the end of the Pleistocene, much of the Pacific Rim from Japan to Beringia, the Pacific Northwest and California, had these relatively lush and resource-rich kelp beds. We have zoological evidence, faunal evidence along the northwest coast. There was black and brown bear, caribou, seabirds, fish, seals, abundant land and floral resources. Theoretically, people could have really traveled along this route and subsisted very well 13,000 or more years ago. If the maritime people colonized Melanesia, the Ryukyu Islands, and Japan from 50 to 35,000 years ago, it seems reasonable and that they were capable of migrating from Northeast Asia into the Americas along the Pacific coast, which was deglaciated and rather warm about 16,000 years ago. This Paleo-Coastal Migration would have included the California Channel Islands, as they were not connected to the mainland at that time. And researchers actually have identified 5 prehistoric archaeological sites dating to the terminal Pleistocene, including what's called Arlington Springs, that date to about 13,000 years ago. Furthermore, on the islands, they've found these chert quarries and workshops which date to about 12 to 11.5. Some of these sites, these very early Paleo-Indian sites, contain crescents and finely made stem points, which were probably used to hunt both birds and sea mammals. Up in the Yukon, up in Alaska, what's interesting is that the caves there consist of a very different set of flaked stone artifacts. Not fluted points, not Paleo-Indian remains that we would have thought should have been occurring there if there was some sort of common connection. But they were filled with what we call microblades, burins, and these wedge-shaped cores. Thousands of tiny, tiny flakes. These were remains of tool making. These artifacts were found in context with extinct horse species, and they have been dated to at least 10,000 years ago or far more. Further excavation has found they date between 12,000 and 15,000 years ago. And how they fit into the puzzle, no one knows. North America during the last glacial maximum was covered with ice. If they came over from Oceania, they'd have to sail by from South Asia across the Pacific Ocean prior to the Beringia migration. Those people might have been exterminated and absorbed by the later arriving Siberian hunter-gatherers. The distance between the Pacific Ocean, between Asia and South America, is very, very vast. Sailing across that area in a small boat with no land masses between it would have been rather challenging. And there's little support that's for anything like that occurring. That trans-Pacific migration route would have been from Southeast Asia or Australia into North America or South America. If they came from Australia and Tasmania, they moved along that subarctic path. If people entered Australia about 40,000 years ago, they had to have come by watercraft. And for that reason alone, the New World could have been reached in a similar way. The Antarctic migration route would come from Australia across to the tip of South America. That's the route. The problems with both of those models is there's really little to no support or any scientific evidence that there was any connection along those lines. There's no genetic evidence, and there's no real connection for the indigenous Australians or the indigenous South America to those that are from those particular areas. Another hypothesis which stirred up a lot of discussion and a lot of ink was spilled and a lot of conversations swam was what we call the Atlantic coastal model. Dennis Stanford and Bruce Bradley suggested that the Clovis was connected to the Solutrean. The Solutrean culture was in Ice Age Western Europe from 20,000 years ago to 17,000 years ago. The model was such that Solutrean hunters and fishermen made their way across the southern edge of the Atlantic, across sea ice to North America. Here's the southern edge of the ice sheet covering Western Europe. That's the Solutrean core area in southern France and Spain. And here's how it would have shaken out. The Solutrean range from 21,000 to 17,000 years ago. Clovis would be sandwiched between 13 and 11, and the Magdalenian would be a little earlier. So here's the Magdalenian Cave Art that we see in Europe about that time. So the arguments against this whole model is the Solutreans weren't a maritime culture. We don't think they had boats. Also, Solutrean points were not fluted like Clovis points. Many Solutrean tools were diamond-shaped, while Clovis points have that distinctive concave base or flute. And there is a gap of at least 4,000 years between the end of the Solutrean and the beginning of Clovis. Yet there is a possible Atlantic coastal route, which could have been traveled from Europe to people eastern United States. As I mentioned, the Solutrean weren't a maritime culture. However, if they were, we do know that there are boats, such as the Solutrean kinds of boats, very simple boats, waterproof caribou skin boats, clothing. The Inuit have them. And the Inuit also have bone needles that are very similar to that of Solutrean. And this is a picture of an Eskimo umiak. And for the Inuit, the Eskimo, in the Arctic, it's not a desert, but a source of plentiful food. So if they had wooden frame boats covered in sealskin, some other means of waterproofing them with whale oil, the boats, even though would look very flimsy, could have actually been pulled onto the ice floes during bad weather. And the modern Inuit actually take very long sea voyages with a minimum equipment. And here's some examples of the Solutrean bifaces, Solutrean blades, and other lithic technology. Now, interestingly enough, the Solutrean points are in fact rather different than Clovis. Here's the Clovis lithic reduction sequence. The bottommost in B, they're prismatic blades. The top are bifaces, and the reduction of those bifaces into the Clovis-style points. However, the points and stone tools found in Berengia are microblades. These are these small little pieces of flakes and prismatic blades that were embedded in wooden shafts and are very distinctive and different from Clovis technology. So that Clovis gap, that 4,000-year gap between the Solutrean and Clovis is certainly an issue. However, Stanford and Bradley believed that there would be a line or a lineage, if you look at Solutrean, through the Cactus Hill pre-projectile point or pre-Clovis to Clovis. And actually, if you look at Solutrean, Cactus Hill, and Clovis, it in fact does make some sense. You have the lanceolate Solutrean points and bifaces. You have a semi-lanceolate triangular piece, which is Cactus Hill, and then after that comes the lanceolate, but yet basally indented and fluted Clovis. So there may still be something to that whole model. Moving ahead to the DNA, the genetic evidence, after years of this controversy, archaeologists, anthropologists, geologists, biologists, all these different ologists and mathematicians were greeted by some hard science, and that was the geneticists. Now, the most newest genetic data, the cutting edge stuff that's just come out in the last few months, it was a team of scientists sequencing 31 complete and 79 partial genomes from North and South America, Siberia, and Oceania. They compared these previously sequenced genomes using 3 ancient skeletons. They had a 24,000-year-old Malta child from Siberia, 12,600-year-old Anzac child from Montana. Anzac was a Clovis, and a 4,000-year-old Sakak individual from Greenland. And what did they find out? Well, they examined the genetic differences through the samples. They tried to determine or retrodict how long ago the various populations diverged, using their ancient genomes to calibrate, sort of a DNA clock. They concluded that all Native Americans, ancient and modern, stem from a single source population, that split from one another in Asia, in Siberia, around 23,000 years ago. They also believe that they moved into the now drowned land of Beringia. So this is the way in which some of the latest genetic evidence sort of shakes out. We can see the 24,000-year-old Malta information split from Siberia 23,000 years ago, Yanzik 12.6, Monteverdi 14.6. We see this north-south connection. We see the early migration in the brown and the Inuit migration, the Athabascans and the late Eskimo, the Inuit occupying a very recent additive immigration. Well, one of the last pieces of the puzzle is language. What can the languages that people spoke historically tell us about the past? Well, we can compare all these different languages and ask for historical linguistics or comparative linguistics to reconstruct the changes through genetics, genetic languages, relationships of languages, linguistic typology. And we can then estimate how much time has passed since the language is separated. It's called lexicostatistical dating, lexicochronology. The basis of that is looking at the current contact historic distribution of languages. And if you see the languages even in North America, the greatest linguistic diversity was in California, which would lead one to think that it was perhaps one of the earliest areas occupied or populated, but we lack the evidence to support that position. The one pioneer linguist who had the courage to take on this particular question was a man by the name of Greenberg. He classified all the languages of Americas into many languages using just three families, Eskimo, Aleut, Nardonnais, and Amerinds. And he talks about looking at the languages and examining them in terms of what they might say about the antiquity of occupation. His work was not greeted well, not well received. He was heavily criticized. And historical linguists believe that his work is inherently unreliable. Nonetheless, his classification and analysis supported three different waves of immigration beginning about 12,000 years ago, which is not that different from the conventional understanding, the most substantial understanding of the peopling of the Americas. If we look at the population size and the number of languages in the Americas, we see some striking information. There's about 1.5 million people in North America speaking 300 languages at the time of historic contact. In Mexico and Central America, there's about 5 million people speaking 300 languages. And in South America and the West Indies, 9 million people with 1,400 languages. Well, if we thought that language diversity or population density had anything to do with the immigration and peopling of the Americas, you would have to say that they went from south to north. But that's not what the data or the evidence supports. One last interesting model and sidebar is the Clovis impact event. This was popular a few years ago and proposed that there was a major impact event where there's a that hit North America and caused the extinction of large megafauna and the demise of the Clovis culture and triggered what was known as the Younger Dryas cold spell at about 12,009. The claim was made that this occurred between 12,800 and 11,500 years ago. This Younger Dryas was a time that lasted 1,300 years. It's when the fresh water from Lake Agassiz poured into the North Atlantic, shut down the thermal highline circulation system, and land temperatures in North America dropped dramatically. The evidence was this charred, carbon-rich layer of soil overlaying about 50 Clovisade sites all across the continent. What they found there was nanodiamonds, metallic minerals, iridium, charcoal, soot, and fullerenes, which are also called buckyballs, and helium-3. All of this evidence would have been associated with the cosmic dust or cosmic outlay from this impact event. Well, the problem was that this particular perspective was hotly contested. The evidence was taken to task and they could not replicate it. And they found that the test implications for such an impact event were not evidence, were not supported. They didn't find Paleo-Indian people declining at 12,900 years ago. They didn't see the extinction occurring of the megafauna simultaneously in South America, which occurred 400 years later. And they found that certain megafauna actually endured. If we look at this in the big picture, you can see the various lithic traditions that are associated with these periods. The pre-Clovis is prior to 14, and the Clovis goes from about 13.5 to about 11.7. It's known as the Paleo-Indian period. When we look at the chronology more recently, you see it break down in archaeological traditions throughout the Southwest. Lastly, but not leastly, the oldest dated rock art in the Americas is actually in the Great Basin. It's on Winnemucca Lake, and they were able to date it because of the chemical buildup in the rocks, and it dates to about somewhere between 11,500 and 13,500 years ago. So, to summarize, we know that there's some recent studies of complete genomes, nuclear DNA, that suggest a single founding population arriving via Berengia from Asia and Siberia. Some other studies suggest there's separate migrations over a period of time. And it's, of course, very clear that more work needs to be done to clarify the peopling of the Americas with larger sample sizes and a wider range of native populations. And regardless of where the first Americans originated or when they arrived, they certainly left us many clues embedded in the millennia of cultures. And I think it's still our task to seek out and decipher those clues. And with that, I'll close. Thank you.
All right. So if anybody wants to ask Alan a question, feel free to just unmute your microphone and ask. But all right, I'm gonna kick it off here with the first question. And Alan, what are some of your, just like, I mean, archaeologists always have their hunches, right? You know, what's your hunch on the peopling of the Americas? What's your sense of it without any evidence, without talking about anything else? How do you think it went down?
Well, I think there's a lot to say about the West. I know there's no evidence, but I still intuitively think that because of the diversity of languages and the richness, the natural abundance of the West Coast, it would seem contrary to sensibility that the area of the West Coast was not populated early in time. Yet the evidence does not seem to support that. The evidence that we have coming at the same time as Clovis, also the projectile point styles that appear in the West are not congruent. They're not Clovis. So it appears that on the islands, when they have 13,000-year-old occupation, they aren't fluted points. They're stemmed points. They're things that look much more like, they look like harpoons.
Right.
And so if there's any smoking gun about this watercraft population, that would be something to think about. Also Verde and that 35,000-year age sort of subsidiary occupation. What's that all about?
Well, and along those lines, I mean, how do you feel about the theories of, like, for example, his name escapes me, but we interviewed him on the Archaeology Podcast Network, the gentleman down in San Diego that analyzed the stuff from the dig from the 90s, from that road project that, I mean, he's claiming he's got basically mastodon bones that were affected or cut, and then tools associated with that from dated to 120,000 years in San Diego. And he claims that they're human related. Now, other people have said, no, this is crazy. You see other stuff like that, but he sent this stuff off to experts and didn't tell them where it came from or what time period it was and said, what do you think of this? And time again, people came back and said, this looks like stuff we see in Africa and Europe from early man. And he said, well, we found it in San Diego. And now whether or not that's actually true, I know. What do you think about the possibility of other migrations to this hemisphere that maybe failed? You know, people came over at some point and it failed and they didn't populate the rest of the country, the rest of the continent.
I think it's definitely possible. I think archaeologists are by their very nature very conservative.
Sure.
And so I think they have to have tremendously persuasive evidence and conclusive evidence and very good examples to cause them to change their minds or receive an alternate explanation.
Okay.
And I think that's what happened with Monteverde, because Monteverde is a perfectly preserved peat bog. So you get vegetation, you get meat, you get wood, you get all the whole repertoire of perishable artifacts. And probably if it wasn't that well preserved, they would have had a problem with receiving that information and sort of making that leap forward to a pre-Clovis platform. And I think that helped.
Okay. Daniel, looks like you unmuted. Do you have a question? Or anyone else? You can unmute down the lower left-hand corner of your screen if you do have a question. I'll let people figure that out here for a second.
Yeah. I saw that Renee Vandekar is here. Marcy Cranon is here. Marge. Yeah. Hi, Marge.
Hi. I want to put in a word for the younger Dryas comet explosion.
Oh, okay. Cool. Yeah, tell me about that.
I heard Dr. Kennett give a 2-hour lecture on his data with 25 other colleagues, and I've read his PNAS, Proceedings National Academy of Sciences papers, and there's just no doubt in my mind that it was a comet explosion, and as the comet broke up, it exploded and started a fire that's manifested as a carbon layer.
Yes.
At 12,800 years ago in 4 continents.
I think it's fabulous. I think it's absolutely large. I love that hypothesis. Because
the northern part of North America and over towards the east. And if you read the papers, there shouldn't be any criticisms. I think the ones that you listed there irritate me because I haven't read the papers.
Of course. I'm very interested in that Clovis impact event. I really am. And I think it would be really interesting to see if there was this iridium layer that they maintain, which is this cosmic dust, and that could be supported. Plus, they even said that the Clovis artifacts themselves, the dark points they found, had some of that extraterrestrial cosmic dust or impact, detritus on it, which sounded to me remarkable. So I like that hypothesis. I do.
Good.
So Marge, you and I can co-author the next paper on the cosmic impact event and how it has been too maligned that there's growing evidence for it. How's that?
Well, the confusing part is not all the animals were killed.
That's right. Yep.
In that area. And, people say, well, it was the spear throwers that people were killing the animals for meat. Well, humans don't eat cats because the cats are at the highest level of the predators and accumulate all the toxins and so forth. They probably don't taste good.
Right.
But, you know, even the primitive societies don't eat cats. They eat things that look like cattle. And
They don't go hunting.
the animals, like in the South America, weren't killed because they weren't in the impacts area.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, Marge. So it sounds like you heard directly from one of the pioneering researchers on this topic, didn't you?
Yeah, Dr. Kennett at the Pacific Coast Archaeology Society meeting. He went on for 2 hours, nonstop.
Fantastic. Well,
Yeah.
Very, very interesting. If there's anything written post sort of that major piece, and you had it electronically, please send it to me, as I would like to read it.
Okay, I will.
Thank you.
Okay, do we have any other questions for Alan on this topic?
Any thoughts from any of the participants about picture representation or some insights and reflection? What do you think, Dan?
I work out of Safford, and I go down to the Lammer site occasionally.
Okay.
We do see the map there. Also, we have Clovis here, but we do not have, oh gosh, my
Clovis.
mind just went blank. The next level.
Oh, Folsom.
Folsom here.
Yeah.
So there appears to have been a lack of population here between Clovis and Cochise.
Yes. Now you're in the Southwest, are you, Dan?
Yes. I'm right where the Anasazi and the Mogollon and the Hohokam kind of meet.
And when you look at the Clovis material you've seen, what is the earliest date for that Clovis material, and is there any evidence for pre-Clovis? And is there any thoughts about where Clovis came from? And what's your thought about sort of the lack of Clovis in the far west, or at least maybe not lack, but sort of its diminution or its limitations?
Unfortunately, the only Clovis point I've ever found was up in South Dakota on a fire. But Meadowcroft has some very good dates for pre-Clovis.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm just very interested in the whole subject. That's why I'm here.
Well, the technology of Clovis is very interesting, and there's been a lot of controversy in the far west, the Great Basin in California. Some people went so far as to say there is no Clovis in California in the Great Basin. And then they also said in some American antiquity articles that Clovis was later in the far west, and there was actually evidence that the western stem points were actually as old or older than Clovis. So that shook everyone up.
There's a lot of people that believe that in the Great Basin.
Yes, but I know that at least in California, in the great state, the golden state of California, and along the western Great Basin, that doesn't seem to be the case. The western Clovis material, the stuff that looks like Clovis and is fluted or concave base, is the most ancient or basement culture, and the western stem is considerably later. It doesn't start until about 8,000, I would say 8,000 to 12,000 years ago. But when you get back from 12 to 13.5, that's when you get that western fluted. Now, what's interesting is the western fluted and the concave base or basally thinned are contemporaneous, and they show continuity and continue much longer than they do in the plains of the American Southwest. Remember how I alluded to that Clovis appears to endure in some places much later than what we think? So that's what happens in California and it appears in the Desert West as well. Thanks, Dan.
Okay. Anything else from the participants?
Can I ask one more question about Greenberg?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I did my BA. My paper was on the peopling of the New World, and we had to look at the three-wave hypothesis. Now, when I looked at Greenberg's work, and this was a number of years ago, so pardon me if I'm wrong, some of the languages down in South America appear to be much older than the languages in North America. And by that I mean it almost looked like the peopling went south to north.
And I alluded to that. I said, if you look at the languages, the frequency, the number of languages, the number of people would seem to argue that South America was the place of initial immigration rather than North America. You saw that, didn't you? Dan, did you see that in the numbers and variety?
I'm trying not to walk over you.
Yeah. So I think there's something to linguistic prehistory and using the classification of languages and reconstructing the nature of prehistoric population movements and replacements by the examination of language. My PhD dissertation is exactly on that topic, linguistic prehistory and prehistoric population movements and prehistory, and examining that and coincidentally examining it vis-a-vis the archaeological record. So I'm a believer, Dan. I think there's something to what you're saying. You still on, Marcy? Sarah, you still on? Or Marge, are you there?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm still here.
Okay. What did you think?
I thought you did a very job, and I've been.
Thank you.
You wanted me to say that, didn't you?
No. I could have done a terrific job. I would take it. I got broad shoulders.
I've been studying this in Omnilore. You know, the California State University Dominguez Hills has a retired program. It's funded through OLI, Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, and I've been studying about the peopling of America, and I actually taught one of those courses and gave the lecture on the Younger Dryas after I heard Kenneth's program. He helped me understand everything and worked on my PowerPoint presentation, which I sent you. So everything I've learned agrees with what you said.
Oh, great, Marge. I'm honored. Thanks for chiming in and participating. I'm honored. Thank you.
Hey,
Thank
Alan.
you.
So my colleague in the room here, Chris, he actually brought up an interesting point. Yeah, come on in. Right here.
Come on.
He actually brought up an interesting point and was wondering how, when you try to take linguistics into the picture and you're studying languages to study the antiquity of these cultures and how they developed, how far advanced is the study of linguistics compared to, say, our archaeological knowledge of these cultures? Is it at that same level, or does it have a little ways to go? Do we think they've nailed it, or, are they?
They're looking at the classification of the languages via family and stock, and then trying to understand the evolution and time depth of those families and stocks, and also what their antiquity is. You can't really do that at the level that we're talking about. You can only go back about 5,000 years. But even based on looking at diversity and the nature of the examination would be based on the diversity and complexity of the languages.
Sure.
And the size and conformation of those of those elements. For instance, when you see a huge pattern of languages that are related and not differentiated, that of course means there's a recent migration. So you can see that, for instance, in the Great Basin. It's rather obvious.
Okay.
And when you examine the languages from that standpoint, you can then come up with certain working hypotheses. And one of the things that seems so odd about the South America example is the number of languages and the number of people. The other thing that seems odd is west of the Rockies, Clovis goes away by comparison to where it was in the east. Why would that be? Why should that occur? If they populated the coastal area at an early date, why didn't they have a more preponderant or a more ubiquitous Clovis expression in the West?
Right.
So,
okay.
Anyways.
All right. Well, I think if there's no other questions, that we will wrap it up right there. Thank you, Alan, for this presentation.
Pleasure.
And encourage others to either join our Patreon page at patreon.com/Team Black, or go over to arccert.black for other live webinars. And you can also follow us on Facebook. We're at Team Black on Facebook. And if you're interested in other audio formats that are free, 100% free, check out the Archaeology Podcast Network at www.arcpodnet.com or wherever you find podcasts. We're on iTunes, Stitcher, Google, Spotify, lots of other places. Tune in. I mean, just search Archaeology Podcast Network or Archaeology Podcast, and you'll find we have over 1,400 episodes in our back catalog of lots of different topics. So check all of it out.
Thank you for coming in and appreciate it.